Hello, and a very warm welcome to all of you who join us for our first International Middle East Conference this morning. It's my distinct pleasure and privilege to initiate the conference today with a keynote speech by Professor Marwan Kraidy. We also have two panels each day that will run this afternoon and tomorrow. I know everyone is here and keen to listen to our speakers and to Professor Kraidy, and the amazing lineup of panelists that we will have in later sessions. So I shall keep my introduction short. My name is Hassan Hakimian, and I'm the director of the Middle Eastern Studies Department at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hamad bin Khalifa University, HBKU for short. I'm also the privileged chair of this promising conference, our first major international Middle East conference for that matter. As head of a young and dynamic department in an equally dynamic college, I can say with confidence that a great collective effort has been put into organizing and conceiving this conference. In fact, our faculty and their traits, both intellectual prowess and personal commitments, are well reflected in the conference ethos and offerings. Professor Marwan Kraidy needs little introduction, as he's well known to many of you. Suffice it to say that he is a renowned Middle Eastern scholar and Dean of Northwestern University in Qatar, one of our partner universities in Doha's Education City. Our own Dean, Dr. Amal Al-Malki, equally well known and not needing an introduction, so you can see I have an easy job this morning, will in a moment or so add her own words of welcome and will then continue as the moderator of this session with Professor Kraidy. I've always believed that to have a good conference, you need a number of essential ingredients. First, a good theme, then a great organizing committee and a good hosting department, of course, followed by excellent panelists and speakers. And last but not least, lively participants in the audience. I'm confident that we shall score well on all these counts, and I hope you won't be disappointed. The theme of the conference is Knowledge and Power in Middle East Studies, Regional and International Perspectives. This is a rich and multi-layered theme and an intriguing one, as it reflects healthy tensions in our intellectual engagement with our discipline. Since its inception, the study of the region designated as Middle East has presented observers and area studies scholars like ourselves with significant challenges. Knowledge of the region, whether with its colonial roots or with increasing contemporary interest, has been fraught with uneven and conflicting perspectives. Part of this tension comes from geographical aspects of what constitutes the region. We could legitimately ask what is middle, or even ask what is east, as is often asked. This actually reminds me of a few years ago when I was in Middle East, visiting a Middle East institute in China, and I realized my hosts were actually talking about Iran, Central Asia, and the Arab countries as the West. I'm sure the initial confusion on my face did not go unnoticed. There's clearly a certain geographical dimension or aspect to how we designate our region, and this is not limited to Middle East studies. It is present in most considerations of regional studies and affects other regions as well. But there are also important conceptual and methodological issues that transcend geography, and these relate to power asymmetry and how knowledge is generated, as implied by the theme of the conference. So the conference is dedicated also to rethinking and reimagining epistemologies, directions, and agendas at the heart of our field. In particular, do colonial legacies and hence the power asymmetry instilled in Middle East studies continue to date? Or can we argue that the rising local and regional capacity in knowledge production and representation of the region has gone some way to redress the old imbalances? Can we, in other words, take some comfort from the rise of local capacity, such as the likes of our own department and several other excellent institutions locally or regionally, in generating a better balance in this regard? I know Professor Kraidy will be addressing some of these themes in the wider context of comparative regional studies. Other sessions and other speakers too will engage and pick up with some of these tantalizing issues from different angles and perspectives. And I will come back at the end to contextualize their contribution within the broader theme. So all in all, we have a lot packed in for you, and I hope you can join us during the upcoming sessions too. We expect a very good audience indeed. Let me now very quickly mention a few housekeeping matters before passing on the baton to Dr. Amal to offer her own words of welcome and conduct the rest of this session this morning. First of all, those of you with an active interest in social media, please note and use the hashtag MEConf and tag our accounts as shown on the screen. A second point, for simultaneous interpreting, especially Arabic, or exclusively Arabic, I should say, there is an app you will need to download. I believe details were emailed to those registered beforehand, but they also appear here on the screen if you need them. You just need to point your camera to the code, and the rest should follow if you still need to set it up. The next point is, of course, we very much look forward to interactions and discussions with our panelists. And there is a Q&A link, which is hidden under the three dots that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen, at the bottom right of your screen. So please send your questions through this box, Q&A box, to all panelists, and we shall do our best to accommodate as many as we can, time permitting. And last but not least, there are some instructions about the choice you have regarding how to view your screen. You can either centralize or pin the main speaker if you like, or you can select a grid so that you can view the speakers side by side. And finally, I promised Dr. Amal to do a very, very short introduction, and I'm not going to disappoint her. Not least because, as I said earlier on, she is well known and doesn't need a long introduction. So for the records, and those who need to be reminded, Dr. Amal Al-Malki is our founding dean at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, CHSS for short. She is a visionary leader dedicated to social justice and especially to women empowerment in Qatar and beyond. These ethos are also well reflected in the college she has founded and leads. And it is my great pleasure to invite her to address you for now. Thank you very much.
Dr. Hakimian, good morning and welcome to our first Middle East conference titled Knowledge and Power in the Middle East Studies, Regional and International Perspectives. The Middle Eastern Department at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hamad bin Khalifa University was founded in 2017 after a year-long informed deliberations that ended with the launch of the department and its first 2 MA degrees. But why would a young college go for a traditional and well-established field of studies represented by top universities in the West? Well, let's pause and reflect on what is this area of studies. The anatomy of Middle Eastern studies, past and present, have several dominating factors that have impacted the cultures, ideologies, and policies of the Middle East and North Africa. From Orientalism to colonialism to post-colonial and new colonialism, the Middle Eastern studies are a constantly changing area of study that don't fall short of ideologies and theories that shaped it and continue to reshaping it. The Eurocentric discourses that made up this field were inherited and still linger until today, maintaining a power dynamic that is certainly not in favor of the people of the Middle East, their histories, and their lived realities. The Middle Eastern Studies Department in the college was established with a clear understanding of the academic tradition, its histories, and its implication on today's life, with an intention to revolutionize the discipline and reinvent it. When we gathered as experts to envision an interdisciplinary Middle Eastern study, we knew exactly what we wanted. We wanted to reposition it, moving it from the peripheral to the center, We also wanted to redefine it, decolonizing it through an authentic production of knowledge that sheds the light on local, regional, and regional perspectives on Middle Eastern studies and build the local knowledge and expertise, and through building capacity in terms of educators and researchers in the field. The Middle Eastern Studies Department was established with an intention to transcend the geographical boundaries of the MENA, Iran, and Turkey, in order to cover the peoples of the areas regardless of where they are living, focusing on their interrelations and interconnectivity with the wider world. The department's interests include the cultures, religions, geopolitics, and the built environment of the MENA, its surrounding influences and interactive forces within and outside it, as well as the study of native and transient populations, both in the historical and contemporary contexts. Our positioning in Qatar, and more specifically in the only national university and education city, qualifies us to be catalysts, bringing needed attention to such an interdisciplinary and diverse area of studies that would benefit a generation adamant in building a better future for their societies through addressing and responding to the new and pressing challenges that their societies face. Grounded in a national agenda to empower the youth, men and women, we launched 2 innovative MA programs that will forward our vision. The MA in Women, Society and Development, which enhances efforts in social, economic, and cultural development in areas that relate to women's issues at the national and the regional levels. It fulfills Qatar's aspiration to contribute to global sustainable development in matters related to women and gender issues, and extend Qatar's insertion into global efforts to promote human development in areas related to women. The second master's program is the MA in Digital Humanities and Societies, which offers a solid knowledge of the political, religious, and socio-cultural contexts that shape emerging digital cultures of the Middle East, and builds deep understanding of evolving cyberspaces and the global resilient forces involved. We established 4 research clusters in the college that focuses on the intersection between power and representation. And they are language, mediation and inclusion, gender equality and empowerment, digital humanities and computational social sciences, Arabic language and multilingual terminology management. Finally, such a conference, besides being a wonderful opportunity to share knowledge, sets the grounds for future researchers through engaging with experts on new discourses pertaining to the Middle East and North Africa. I'm very thankful to the conference chair, Professor Hakimian, and faculty members of the Middle Eastern Department for the exceptional work they have put in organizing this conference. And I'm grateful to all of the speakers who will be sharing their work with us. I'm also proud of our MA and PhD students for attending today and participating in one-of-a-kind opportunity that was made possible by the new mediums of communication. Of course, sometimes it feels like imposed on us due to the pandemic, but it worked very well. I will end by emphasizing that knowledge is power, and it's about time we claim this power. Thank you so much. Back to you, Dr. Hakimian.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amal, for those very kind, encouraging, and forward-looking, future-facing remarks. It sets an excellent tone for a conference which, as I said earlier, has been truly exciting for us and also very promising. We have a very good number of participants at the moment. I mentioned the necessary ingredients for a good conference. I forgot to say, when I used to do similar introductions in London, I would always put bad weather outside so that good weather wouldn't interfere with proceedings inside the session. Nowadays, as you know, things have changed. We're not even under one roof. And of course, we thought very carefully about time zones, as this is a main challenge for international conferences. But we were very much also directed by the fact that Tuesday, the 8th of February, is a National Sports Day here in Qatar. It's a public holiday. So we were very keen to run and conclude the conference on Sunday and Monday. I know many participants join us from very different time zones in Europe, for instance, on a Sunday morning, early hours. So we hope we will have the pleasure of their company and others, of course, from North America who have registered and will join us later in this afternoon and tomorrow our time. Anyhow, this is all very tantalizing, and we have, as the icing on the cake, a renowned Middle Eastern scholar and someone who has actually joined the education city in Qatar at Northwestern University to take the helms, and that is Professor Marwan Kraidy. Without further ado, let me invite him to offer his thoughts. And as I said earlier, I will be handing over to Dr. Amal, who would be acting as the moderator. Please don't forget to field your questions aimed at all panelists in the Q&A box. And we will do our utmost to try and address as many of them as we can. If you prefer your name not to be mentioned when fielding your question, if and when fielding your question, please specify. Otherwise, I think Dr. Amal might mention your first name or your name, if you don't mind. Anyhow, that's for further down the line. Over to you, to Professor Marwan Kraidy. We're all eager to hear you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and good morning from Doha. It's really a pleasure and an honor to deliver this keynote address today at a university that is a vital partner to my own institution. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Amal Al-Malki, founding dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at HBKU, Dr. Hassan Hakimian, chair of the Middle East Studies Department, for their very kind invitation to share my thoughts on the future of Middle East studies, focusing on knowledge and power. I also want to thank Dr. Mark Owen Jones, who's an assistant professor at HBKU, for the connection and the colleagueship. I would like to emphasize that I'm speaking today mainly in my capacity as professor and scholar, not necessarily as dean of Northwestern Qatar, although that role will seep in, and I'll mention when. The question I am grappling with today is this: what would a decidedly transnational and comparative Middle Eastern studies look like? In this keynote, I try to elaborate a vision of Middle East studies that envisions the Middle East as a nexus rather than a locus. A nexus of a variety of historical and contemporary forces, relations that continue to shape the region and the world beyond our region. Whereas locus suggests a container approach to Middle East studies, nexus entrenches a relational epistemology that considers circulation, contestation across, within, and without the borders of the Middle East, connecting this region with other world regions and with global forces, while at the same time taking account local issues. Drawing from some of my own research, I will try to propose a roadmap to such an approach in Middle Eastern studies. Now, by necessity, a roadmap involves proposals with broad aims and relatively sweeping claims. So since my charge in this keynote is to offer general thoughts on knowledge and power in Middle East studies, I would like to apologize in advance for not focusing my talk on actual empirical research. So this will not be a sort of a strictly speaking scholarly talk with an empirical focus. That will certainly use some examples. I will discuss Arab thinkers. I will not center Arab thinkers as I usually would, because I'd like to discuss them around or in a caster, in a wider cast, in comparison with authors in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia. Of course, these are reified categories, but I think you know what I mean. Finally, I'm approaching this as a very preliminary set of comments and incomplete ideas that are quite experimental, with the hope that they will generate engagement, questions, and criticism from you. So the first part is in praise of undisciplined disciplines. Let me begin with a confession. I was not trained in Middle East studies per se, but rather in the discipline of communication, which, as I have written elsewhere, borrowing from the famous American cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz's quip about anthropology, is an undisciplined discipline. An undisciplined discipline, right? And I want to just make sure here to flag one thing for the at least the bilingual audience and our translator. The discipline is both adab and takhassus, right? And so I will be playing on these two meanings of the word discipline and what undisciplined discipline means and what redisciplining Middle Eastern studies means. Communication as a field or as a discipline is undisciplined in many ways. It is fragmented in subdisciplines that are as different as, for example, neuroscience and literature, which are both part of the field of communication, at least approaches developed in these fields. Communication as a field borrows seemingly from every possible arena of human knowledge. It was multidisciplinary in structure and interdisciplinary in spirit before these terms were fashionable. In short, communication as a discipline itself may be considered a nexus rather than a locus, a field of vectors of intellectual ideas that meet, compete, collide, and reassemble like a swarm to form new subfields that are themselves always changing. Now, some would say, you could say, that all disciplines grow by borrowing from one another. This would obviously be true. However, communication, in the field of communication, there's a lack of a central unifying concern or concerns of canonical perspectives that bind the field together. Communication is truly an undisciplined discipline that is post-paradigmatic. There is no single paradigm that guides the discipline. There aren't even a few paradigms that guide the discipline. An ever-changing set of emerging technologies, of shifting relations, of new ideas, of recalibrated exchanges continue to shape concepts, theories, and methodologies in our field as much as they are shaped by them. In communication, relationality is central, movement is endemic, and change is permanent. It is likely my training that leads me to think of Middle Eastern studies as a nexus rather than a locus. So of course, even though I wasn't trained, strictly speaking, in Middle East studies, that is my intellectual home, or one of my intellectual homes, and I'm very engaged with some of the work in Middle Eastern studies. After all, regional or area studies focus on geopolitically bounded areas that share languages and histories of war, of exchange, and mixing. Before area studies in the United States, shaped by the Cold War, there were the European Orientalists, those intellectual companions of colonialism and imperialism. To a large extent, these different traditions have treated area or regional studies as what I would call expertise within a container. Think of another invention that comes to us from the US. The word think tank is quite revealing. It's a space of research dedicated to informing public policy. But a tank is a reservoir, a container, which contains and stores thoughts. In this context, the pursuit of knowledge is instrumental, not organic. It is shaped by the very short-term demands of policy, not by the cumulative demand of developing grounded ideas and thoughts and ways of knowing. Nonetheless, we must remember that containers always leak, that people travel, that ideas circulate, seemingly with ever higher velocity and on a broader scale today. So the preceding, what I've just said, beckons repeating my central question and reiterating some central concerns. What would a decidedly transnational, relational, comparative Middle East studies look like? I propose to envision the Middle East as a nexus, rather than a locus, to repeat myself, of historical and contemporary forces that shape relationships within the region and beyond. I want to be clear about one thing. Approaching Middle East studies as a nexus cannot and should not and must not mean that we should abandon the language training, the deep critical expertise, and the ethical commitments that developed within Middle East studies and other regional and area studies. What I'm rather advocating is an explicit realignment of these skills in language, expertise in areas, and ethics towards connection, comparison, and construction with contexts and concepts external to our region, not only from within the region. So whereas Locus suggests a container approach to Middle Eastern studies, Nexus entrenches a relational epistemology that considers, again, circulation and contestation and other exchanges within, across, and without the borders of our region, connecting us with other world regions and with global forces, while at the same time enabling a focus on various scales, right? So we shouldn't only focus on the region, for example, the Arab region. The various scales I have in mind, of course, are the local, the national, the regional, and the global, but they need to be understood and studied through methodologies, again, that operate between and within and across these concepts, right? These contexts. So these methodologies are what have been called translocal, transnational, and transregional, right? That cut across boundaries and within spaces. If regions are containers, then the question becomes, how can we account for leakages, for osmosis, and mixture between these containers? In short, how can we undiscipline Middle East studies from its historical legacies and rediscipline it in a more worldly, more capacious, and more experimental arena? So in this sense here, redisciplining is i'adat ta'dib, right? I'm not talking about takhassus anymore. So Locus and Nexus. As an accidental humanist, I have always found etymology, the study of the history of words, to be revealing of the multiple meanings that words contain. Locus and Nexus have long and rich histories as word. Therefore, they can be very useful concepts, very capacious concepts, concepts that allow us to understand much more than their strict meaning. So let's talk a little bit about the etymology, the history of these two words. The word locus comes to us from Latin. It means a place or a center of activity. It is closely connected to the word focus, which we also use a lot. Focus refers to the hearth, the fire pit at the center of the house that in the old days used to serve as a gathering spot for families, where food was cooked, where light was provided by the fire, and where heat was provided. Whatever provides shelter, food, heat, and light provides sustenance, or life itself. Another word that's connected to locus, of course, is the word local, which today connotes the smallest level, at least in some fields, the smallest level of social or political organization, and the familiar small geosocial space of belonging and intimacy. That derives from locus as well. So we can think of locus as a space of intimate belonging and tacit knowledge, as the fount of historical lineage and identity. The word nexus also comes to us from Latin, and the root of the word is the Latin nectere. It means to bind, a binding together, and by the mid-17th century in Europe, it was used to denote not just a link, not just a bond, but also, quote, an interdependence between members. Interdependence. The root also gives the basis for the English verb to connect, connection, net, and node. And it also has the connotation of fastening, of binding together. Etymology, as I mentioned, is quite interesting. And in this case, it warns us against thinking of the notion of nexus as connoting a space that is equal, that is not laden by the power relations that shape knowledge, the theme of this conference. Indeed, the root nectere is also the basis for the English to annex, annexation, which in our contemporary world clearly means to forcibly seize, control, and hold territory. A clear geopolitical connotation of the term nexus. In addition, the same root is behind the ancient Roman legal concept of nexum. Nexum, as defined in Lewis and Short's 1879 a Latin dictionary, refers to a contractual obligation. This is what they say, quote, a person who has contracted a nexum or obligation is of such a kind that if they fail to pay their debt, their creditor would compel them to work as a servant until the debt was paid. So somebody who's contracted a nexum becomes an indentured servant. Nexus, therefore, is not free of power politics, right? It's both in the geopolitical and the socioeconomic realms laden by power relations. Yet, Nexus entails both exchange and collaboration, but also competition, the struggle for power, and violent domination. It covers multiple spheres of human life: meaning and power, culture and economics, agency and structure, the individual and the collective, the local and the national. It is applicable in both the social sciences and the humanities. That is why I believe Nexus and its contrast with Locus is a heuristic concept for us to try and re-envision Middle East studies. Again, I want to be clear that I do not claim to have invented this perspective. I am rather building on the work of several esteemed colleagues in Middle East studies, but also in other areas, including, and I'll make a special connection to this, American studies, who have come up with building blocks for a relational, comparative, and transnational vision centered in multidisciplinary work. Many Middle East studies scholars have done excellent transnational, comparative, and relational work. And with the center of the gravity in the Middle East having moved to the Gulf, it is no wonder that some of the most interesting recent work focuses on the Gulf. Let me give you a few examples. Think of Laleh Khalili's Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula, which puts the Gulf at the center of the infrastructure of global capitalism. Think of Beyond Exception, New Interpretations of the Arabian Peninsula by Ahmed Khanna, Amélie Le Renard, and Neha Vora, which advances novel anthropological and sociological frameworks for understanding the Gulf. Outside of the Gulf, there are many such works recently as well. Think of Zena Ma'asri's Cosmopolitan Radicalism, the Visual Politics of Beirut's Global 60s, which imagines one city as a node of visual cultural production in third world anti-imperialist movements. Not to mention a rich body of work on language, migration. Of course, I think of Dr. Al-Malki's work on migration. I think of HBKU's own Dr. Ray Raidini's. On media and geopolitics, I think of Dr. Mark Owen Jones. What all these works suggest to me is a tacit understanding of the Middle East as a nexus, not as a locus. So again, I am not inventing a new way of seeing the world. Rather, consider my comments as a call to connect and consolidate existing and emerging work that tacitly embraces the Middle East as nexus into a well-defined and explicitly recognized approach to scholarship. So I mentioned American studies. Take, for example, how that field, which you would expect to be focused on the Americas, or at least, more narrowly on the United States, where it developed. In contrast, American studies has birthed a large, vibrant, and influential subfield known as transnational American studies. Rather than focusing on the histories, politics, and cultures of the United States alone, or of the Americas in separation from the rest of the world, transnational American studies set out to explore the US and the Americas as a node of connection from local to global, from indigenous struggle against settler colonialism by Native Americans in the US heartland to imperial adventures all over the world. And these two aspects connect in a context like Hawaii, for example. Clearly, the fact that the US is a global superpower has enabled and shaped the emergence of a transnational American studies that is humanistic, critical, and internationalist. Nonetheless, that field has fully embraced the notion of area studies or regional studies as nexus rather than locus. I find transnational American studies to be very directly relevant to us in Middle East studies, partly because of the established transnational research tradition that it has entrenched and created and developed, but also because some of the leading scholars in transnational American studies have actually focused on the US encounter, the US connection with the Middle East. I'll give you a few examples, some of the classics and some of the more recent works. Think of Melanie McAllister's book, Epic Encounters, Culture, Media, and US Interests in the Middle East. Think of Alex Lubin's Geographies of Liberation, the making of an Afro-Arab political imaginary. And also his more recent Never-Ending War on Terror. Think of the late Amy Kaplan's Our American Israel, the story of an entangled alliance. This scholarship set the ground for emerging work on migration, on performance, on African-American Palestinian solidarity that shows how vibrant transnational scholarship can be and how it can continue between generations. I want to move now to South relations and what we might mean when we use the word Global South. And let me go back to sort of my own intellectual biography, because that's really the one way I know in which to express my thinking on this. So my own intellectual project, since I was in graduate school, has focused on exploring and entrenching the importance of South-to-South connections in communication research. And I want to say this was not an agenda that I decided upon as I started graduate school, but this is rather the culmination of a variety of ideas, of courses, of conversations with all kinds of colleagues that led me down that path, right? These connections can be epistemological, empirical, historical, technological, particularly for me personally, again, because of my own training, because of my own preferences and predilections, the incredibly rich connections and resonances between the Middle East and Latin America. This comes from the twin forces of a personal quest and an intellectual yearning to answer one single question: how do we in the non-West, particularly in the Arab world, become modern without losing ourselves? In my first book, Hybridity or the Cultural Logic of Globalization, from 2005, I explored the concept of hybridity as both process and product. So one way to translate hybridity in Arabic, of course, is ikhtilat, but ikhtilat is fraught because it means so many different things. But we can think of hybridity as process, as tahjeen, and as product, as hajana, for example, of various contexts in the Global South. In that book, I focused on Lebanon and Mexico and the US, and how these different places and cultural traditions negotiate Western modernity. 5 years later, in another book, Reality Television and Arab Politics, Contention in Public Life, I interpreted the then raging reality television controversies in the Arab world as trials, in which different Arab countries, from Lebanon and Syria to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, put modernity on trial, negotiated or performed their own preferred version of modernity. Because of the political, economic, and cultural power of the West, and because of the enormous contributions of Western thought, this negotiation cannot be done without including the West. However, Western modernity cannot be adopted wholesale, but rather through dual processes of adoption and adaptation on the one hand, refusal and rejection on the other hand. And what you get in the middle is a very negotiated modernity. Let's stick to the reality television controversies and look how they ended in the Arab world. The controversies ended shortly after the emergence of two programs. And I'm not establishing a causal relationship here, right? But I'm correlating a variety of developments. So the controversies over reality TV ended after two programs showed how a Western format can be adapted to Gulf cultures and society. Reality television as a format, as a set of intellectual property and rules of production emerged in the Netherlands, right? And then went to the UK and then to the US and then became a global phenomenon. So what are these two shows? The first one emerged in the United Arab Emirates. It was called Green Light, Ad-Daw al-Akhdar. It's a reality show that foregrounded Islamic charity, right? So it was a combination of a format that was foreign, that was controversial, with local concerns that are seen as very desirable goals and objectives. Qatar enacted a fitting conclusion to these controversies with actually a Qatar Foundation project named Stars of Science, which integrated some components of the reality TV format with the vital objective of encouraging youth into the development of a knowledge-based society. In the socio-political realm, years later, we saw brilliant adaptations of global repertoires of activism and contention, tracing all the way back to the French Revolution in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and others in the Arab Uprising, as I showed, among many others, in the Naked Blogger of Cairo, Creative Insurgency in the Arab World. But my own work here is a minuscule contribution to comparative work on multiple modernities that focus on South-to-South relations. I want to give you a few examples here. Consider the collaborative initiative called the Latin East, the brainchild of US-based scholars who study the Arab world and Latin America. Amar Dahi, Alejandro Velasco, and Sinan Antun were the founders. Encompassing humanists and social scientists, the project held a unique conference in New York City in 2017, with participants presenting mostly in English, but discussing in a delightful mixture of English, French, Arabic, Farsi, Turkish, Spanish, and Portuguese. Revised proceedings were later published, showing the promise of this kind of work. I was very fortunate and privileged to have contributed to that conference, and an essay in the publication comparing how the Argentinian-Mexican scholar Nestor Garcia Conclini and the Saudi literary critic Abdullah al-Ghaddami define modernity, each in a variety of nested contexts. So on the one hand, it was Mexico, Latin America, America. On the other hand, it was Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and the Arab world. Another example I could mention, and here's where perhaps my hat as dean is coming on my head, the Institute for Advanced Study in the Global South, which we recently launched at NUQ in collaboration with Qatar Foundation and Northwestern University, seeks to incubate and promote our faculty and students' evidence-based storytelling on the histories, societies, cultures, and media of the Global South, positioning Qatar, the Gulf, and the Arab world as a nexus of flows of ideas, images, and people. We hope to publish our scholarly research and our creative media making in several languages. We also plan to use all technologies to disseminate the work, from the traditional academic article and book to documentary filmmaking and game design to any modality afforded by digital tools. This transnational, multilingual, and multimodal approach signals, again, that we are a nexus, not only a locus. I want to also mention the Arab Council for the Social Sciences in Beirut, which has really played a leading role in not only fomenting local Arab knowledge production, but also in translating and adapting all kinds of concepts and ideas and perspectives to the Arab world, including notions of gender, of race, of territorialization, so on and so forth. So we do have several working projects that are working towards the goals that I'm trying to outline. Let us explore these questions a bit more conceptually. How have various thinkers considered the Global South as a context and South-to-South relations as an approach? What can we learn from them today? In Theory from the South, or How Euro-America is Evolving Towards Africa, the authors warn us that, quote, Western Enlightenment thought has posited itself as the wellspring of universal teaching, of universal learning, and regarded the non-West, variously known as the ancient world, the Orient, the primitive world, the third world, the underdeveloped world, the developing world, and now the Global South, primarily as a place of parochial wisdom, antiquarian traditions, exotic ways and means. Above all, they say, the Global South is primarily, in Western Enlightenment thought, a place of, quote, unprocessed data. In other words, the Global South offers only information that can only be analyzed, interpreted, and transformed into knowledge in Western research institutions thousands of kilometers away. Said differently, the modern West, in this view, casts the rest as mere tradition. Then the authors ask the fundamental question, quote, what if we posit that in the present moment, it is the Global South that affords privileged insight into the workings of the world at large? Said differently, what if we postulate that the Global South is the crucible of various modernities, each distinct, all different from one another, but somehow all modern? Further thoughts on this appears in elementary aspects of the political histories from the Global South, where the Indian historian Pratama Banerjee, who works at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, writes that she uses Global South to, quote, express solidarity with the intellectual mobilization happening around that term in academies of distant regions, including the decolonial institutional sites of Africa and Latin America. Her main concern in the book, of course, is to historicize and contextualize the rise of the notion of the political. But, she says, when she asked, what is the political? She asked it from, quote, a crossroad that is no one's own country, but only a modest meeting place where we share our philosophies and histories with each other. She concludes that the advantage with the Global South as a concept is that it's indeed a non-place. Quote, what we might achieve is certainly not a universal political theory, but perhaps unprecedented chords and productive discords by way of making music separately together. Banerjee's musical metaphor recalls Edward Said. I find it very helpful to think of South-to-South relations as musical resonances, following Edward Said's adaptation of musical language to understand literature, society, and culture in what he calls contrapuntal reading, using the notion of counterpoint in musicology, which refers to links between multiple musical voices that are interdependent in harmony, but autonomous in melody or rhythm. It is useful to consider different spheres of the Global South, including, of course, the Middle East, as counterpoints, politically, socioculturally, economically, ideationally. Interdependent in harmony and autonomous in melody or rhythm. That is, these are the terms of this connection. In this vein, if we think of the Global South as a master concept, then South-to-South relations can be understood not only as an approach to knowledge that displaces the West as a monopolistic epistemological center, but again as a contrapuntal methodology. The Global South should not be seen as only a geographical container, as a list of countries, as an ideological space. Of course, it is all of the above, but it's also a conceptual category that enables a new kind of thinking. It is an invitation to engage in an inclusive, all-encompassing conversations about what becomes possible when we put in the center locations and experiences that have historically been at the margins. It is inclusive because there is a space for everyone in that discussion, no matter how broad or deep your experience is with the concept, the idea, or the place. For grounding the Global South as an invitation to return to Edward Said musical language, it is an invitation to compose and perform together to enable new sounds or new ideas to emerge, and therefore new frameworks to guide us. In doing so, we should be careful and avoid turning Global South into a homogeneous category, flattening the rich global diversities of countries and cultures into a conceptual monolith. After all, we need to remember from Deleuze and Guattari, who in their book, What is Philosophy, reminded us that concepts are internally diverse, open to multiple interpretations, propensities, and potentialities. To return to Banerjee then, the key question is, quote, about what kinds of conceptual insights and conceptual personae of global salience emerge from a faithful study of Southern realities and materialities if we actually pay attention to them by taking off what she described as our Marxist, Foucauldian, Agambanian, or Latourian spectacle. Now, she's referring to these titans of European philosophy, and by spectacles she means glasses, not spectacle in the Debordian sense. So it would be nadharat, not ard, right? So as we establish a South-to-South framework, we face two risks, among others. First, we should avoid the temptation of countering Western intellectual domination with a kind of a Middle Eastern or an Arab intellectual nativism. We ought to choose critical engagement over rigid rejection. Second, there's a risk in adopting a perspective that claims to be universal, what has been called the view from nowhere. We will be replicating the error of some Western thought that cast its particularistic interest as universal. One way to avoid falling into these two traps is to ground the notion of nexus in our actual geophysical region and its study, i.e. Middle East and Middle East studies, which allow us to practice what I described as a contrapuntal reading after Said, while remaining grounded in a set of contexts that we revisit and traditions that we critique and develop. Let me now return to my own undisciplined discipline, communication, and think of the impact that early research on media and society in the Middle East has had not only on global media research, but on the social sciences at large, at least in the American tradition. Initially, work on media in the Middle East and comparative work on media and modernity and society were the same thing. Consider some of the classics. Let's focus for a minute on Daniel Lerner's classic, The Passing of Traditional Societies, Modernizing the Middle East from the 50s. This was described, often described as, quote unquote, the Bible of modernization theory. It is a study of information diffusion in a few Middle Eastern countries and became a founder of modernization theory. Its major premise was that under the influence of media campaigns, of information campaigns, people transitioned from being traditionalists to becoming modernists through a process of empathy and identification. Until campaign after campaign, over time, the entire society becomes modernized. Setting aside the big difference between modernity, modernization, and modernism, which Lerner did not even broach, and to be fair to him, these were not a very well-developed conversation in the 50s. But Lerner's theory of modernization can be captured in one famous phrase that really underscores why it is problematic. Mecca or modernization? That was his choice, right? By saying that basically people have to choose Mecca or modernization, Lerner in the 50s set Islam as the seat of tradition and the opposite of the modern. I've always wondered what he would say to the combination of Mecca and modernization, right? Or Mecca and mechanization is what he says, right? For example, think of cell phones that have the compass that turns to Mecca for prayer times, right? It's just, you know, let's just say that Daniel Lerner's formulation did not survive the 20th century. But according to his view, I think what's interesting and what we need to really struggle against is that there can only be one modernity, the Western kind, and that non-Western countries' only path to modernity resides in imitating the West and converging on its values and practices. That was the 1950s, when the diffusion of innovations occurred mostly from West to West, right? We have in international media research, we have half a century of studies showing how lopsided the flow of media and culture is, that it emanates in Europe and North America and goes to the rest of the world. But fast forward a few years, and now the rest, the global South, is not only a source of media and culture, but in a few places, it exports media, information, and culture to the entire world. So let me bring this back to a specific empirical example from my own work. A couple of years ago, 2 summers ago to be exact, I visited Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, to give a lecture at a university there and to conduct field research on a phenomenon that I had been pursuing since 2008, when in the conclusion of my reality TV book, I observed that just like the reality TV controversies have pulled a lot of Arab viewers and created debate in society, now we see the new Turkish television dramas. That's when Noor was aired first by NBC in Dubai and became very popular in the Arab world. So one of the things that I started pursuing back then is this global thread, the global spread of Turkish serial television fiction, right? Of Turkish musalsalat, which are known as dizi among some people in Turkey. That phenomenon, which I had dubbed alongside collaborators as Neo-Ottoman cool, started in Arab-speaking countries in the Balkans, spread to Europe, then to Africa, then to Latin America, and now, thanks to Netflix, is a truly global phenomenon. So I initially traveled to Buenos Aires with a plan to interview media producers, directors, and writers about how Argentina's own media production industry was being affected by these cheap Turkish imports and how it was reacting and dealing with them. I did do some of that research and I got some pretty amazing empirical data. But what I also got was the proverbial ethnographic slap in the face. When you're shocked in the thrill and joy of being in the field and doing field research, you're slapped in the face when you realize that what you were looking at was a lot more richer than you ever imagined, or when you have a missing dimension that you suddenly become aware of in a fieldwork encounter. I found out in that way about an incredibly rich dimension of the phenomenon that I had neglected before, which was the role of the large and active Armenian-Argentinian community in Buenos Aires, which, in coordination with their sister community in Santiago de Chile, organized a campaign to pressure politicians and media owners in Buenos Aires and in Santiago to not show any Turkish series on Argentinian television. So I initially, again, went to Buenos Aires to research media imports and their impact on the local industry. And I was instead plunged in a rich environment, a nexus of far-reaching connections from Buenos Aires to the Bosphorus, from the Armenian genocide to a contemporary media market, not only a locus of media consumption, but, and I have my colleague at Northwestern, Pablo Bukowski, recently published a book called Abundance about the distinctive peculiarities of the Argentinian digital media scene, at least. But I saw this as, again, a nexus, not a locus, right? So basically, the Armenian diaspora in South America mobilized because of the memory of the Armenian genocide against having Turkish television drama playing on television every night. Here I want to highlight one aspect of this ongoing empirical studies that was most interesting and most meaningful to me. The revival of Armenian memory and activism in Argentina around the foundational violence of a genocide that had occurred more than 100 years ago and more than 10,000 kilometers away points to another richness of this kind of transnational research, which is that the connection through contemporary media of various and multiple layers of histories that are then experienced simultaneously. This is what Latin American scholars called tiempos mixtos, or mixed times. I prefer the translation mixed temporalities, right? الزمنيات المختلطة in Arabic, based on the coexistence in a community's everyday life of various historical strata. So Nestor Garcia Canclini, for example, refers to a very particular place in Mexico City. It's called Plaza de las Tres Culturas, which is the square of the three cultures, where you see pre-Hispanic indigenous elements, architectural elements. You see a Spanish colonial church, and then you see a tower, a business tower of contemporary modern Mexico, right? And he says, these are the three cultures that any contemporary Mexican has to deal with in their experience of everyday life. So what's the way forward after all these examples? In her book, Southern Theory, the Australian sociologist Raewyn Connell wrote, quote, that only knowledge produced on a planetary scale is adequate to support the self-understanding of societies now being forcibly reshaped on a planetary scale. So to understand global problems, we need globally produced knowledge. A South-to-South dialogue that does not exclude Western thought, but that nonetheless centers what she calls Southern theory, helps us avoid a consequence of the work of some of the Islamic modernists of the past, like Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, whose reinterpretation of Arab and Islamic sources was shaped to a large extent by European liberal thought. The result, described by Albert Hourani in his landmark and classic Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age, 1798 to 1939, was to make, quote, Islamic concepts equivalent to the guiding principles of European thought at the time. So, Ibn Khaldun's Umran gradually turns into Gizeh's civilization. The maslaha of Maliki jurists and Ibn Taymiyyah into the utility of John Stuart Mill. The ijma' of Islamic jurisprudence into the public opinion of democratic theory, and so on and so forth. My favorite is actually how Ibn Khaldun's Asabiyya, for example, is always translated as solidarity. Solidarity captures maybe a small slice of what Asabiyya means, right? But what Hourani was writing about, and what it's an obstacle for me that I encounter repeatedly in my work, is the seeming necessity to find the perfect word that captures the original Arabic concept in French or in English or in Spanish or in German, right? While it would be foolish, again, to reject Western thought wholesale, I think our objective in shaking its monopoly as a source of theories should begin by a process of critical translation of concepts, which I argue we lack. We need criticism and decolonization, dialogue and transformation going on at the same time. We clearly do not need more imitation or rote adherence, But we also do not need a debilitating wholesale rejection of non-native thinking and theory. A critical, selective engagement is the most productive way forward. The terms of what selective means, I think, could be the subject of future debates and conferences. Grounded in Middle East studies, we can understand the experiences of the region as part of the Global South, not only as prepackaged empirical data ferried to other institutions elsewhere for analyses that sometimes exoticize more than they enlighten, but think of these as stories to think with, to theorize, and to critique the inward focus that besets so much research in the social sciences and the humanities. Putting the Global South at the center of our approaches and establishing it as a source of theory building, in addition to as a provenance of data, reorients our epistemological sensibilities not only to cultures that were previously ignored, exoticized, or subordinated, but to one that sees connections previously unseen, notices issues previously unheeded, and takes paths previously not taken in the Global South and elsewhere. After all, as the French sociologists Paul Fauconnet and Marcel Mauss wrote 120 years ago in what was a foundational text for sociology, quote, "Serious research leads one to unite what is ordinarily separated and to distinguish what is ordinarily confused," end of quote. I think we would do very well in heeding that advice, even if it comes from 120 years ago and from elsewhere. We do need to read, to engage, to criticize, to adapt the ideas of Arab scholars as we need to read, to engage, to criticize, and adapt the ideas of scholars from anywhere and everywhere else. On the issue of Arab modernity, for example, we have a rich constellation of thinkers. I'll mention only a few names. I mentioned Abdullah al-Ghaddami already. We have Muhammad Banis, we have Abdel Ilah Balqaziz, Muhammad Riyad al-Daqdaqi, and many others that are now laying foundation, conceptual foundation, epistemological foundation, about what we can mean, what could an Arab modernity look like, or what it should look like. Al-Ghaddami, for example, foregrounds what he calls aware self-criticism. Abdel Ilah Balqaziz goes as far as locating the very origin of the notion of multiple modernities in the writing of the Tunisian intellectual and historian of Islam, Hisham Jaid. In his comparison of Arab and Western modernity, in نقد الحداثة في الفكر العربي المعاصر, or critique of modernity in contemporary Arab thought, for example, Al-Daqdaqi has mapped the terrain for us. He says, there's a rejectionist movement, right? At-Tayyar al-Rafid. There's a modernist movement, At-Tayyar al-Hadathi. And there's the accommodationist movement, At-Tayyar al-Tawfiqi, which he believes, or which believes, quote, that it's impossible to harmonize between the Arab and Western heritages or civilizational balance sheets. I do believe, if it's not clear enough, that the accommodationist space, a critically negotiated accommodation, a selectively negotiated accommodation, is our path forward, even if my own definition of what an accommodationist approach towards modernity may differ from Professor Al-Daqdaqi's. To do so from the perspective of Middle East studies, we need first to build endogenous research capacity that is not content with replicating empirical findings using theories developed elsewhere, but to modify, to criticize, and sometimes to supplant imported theories using original empirical research. This is an important way to address what Elizabeth Kassab, who's a professor at the Doha Institute, in her book Contemporary Arab Thought, Cultural Critique and Comparative Perspective, called, quote, the deep yearning for a holistic vision that could offer an indigenous, non-alienating worldview and mobilize the necessary forces towards a way out of humiliation and oppression. This endogenous knowledge production capacity should be collaborative. Clearly, very few of us have the expertise to tackle complex problems on our own. It should be multidisciplinary. It also should be multilingual to allow for the translation and importation of all kinds of ideas from all over the world. I propose that it should be driven by an agenda, again, that begins by shifting the place of the Middle East and more broadly of the Global South in 5 ways. So number one, as I've been arguing now for the last 40 minutes, shift our conception of the region from locus to nexus. Number two, shift our approach, our methodology, from a focus on the region as a source of data that we extract to the region as a space of knowledge that we construct and build. A third shift, number three, to shift from looking at events from the local, national, regional, or global level to a methodology that focuses on relations and connections rather than entity, what we have called and what many other people call in the field translocal, transnational, transregional. Shift number four, in keeping with the notion of tiempos mixtos, of mixed temporalities, shift from an understanding of a linear time to a time that is cyclical, right? Because multiple temporalities is really one way that makes the experience of multiple modernities, even the very idea of multiple modernities, possible. And finally, shift our thinking that from this very dominant sort of center-periphery approach, clearly power imbalances remain globally embedded. But if we shift the focus to the south-to-south aspect of the relationship, that will inevitably encompass the global north, which imprints the global south in so many different ways. So shift our thinking from center-periphery to south-to-south. So to reiterate and conclude, one, from locus to nexus, two, from data to knowledge, second, from scales to approaches, fourth, from linear time to multiple temporalities, and five, from center-periphery to south-to-south. We in the Gulf have a unique opportunity and truly a responsibility with our unique combination of location, of mandate, and of resources to take a leading role in the building of post-carbon knowledge societies and be at the forefront of this initiative to rethink Middle Eastern studies as a globally oriented, cosmopolitan, capacious enterprise. Here in Qatar, in Doha, with the closeness of multiple institutions coming from different educational traditions, not only the education city universities, but also Qatar University, the Doha Institute, we really have no excuse not to do so. So I hope we can get to work, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Dr. Kraidy, Dean Kraidy, and such an amazing and rich talk that will stay and resonate with us for some time. And I know that many will have questions. I see some posting questions. But the whole idea, and I've put some points down, especially those that resonate with my own work, and you know how I'm a big fan of your work as well. Centering Southern theories and setting a dialogical relation with other theories is important. Said's traveling theories travel and ideas circulate. And you touched on hybridity as well, and the hybrid projects of modernity that actually uses techniques from translation and communication theories. We talk about localization, foreignization, right? And I also would forward an example that shook me to the core. So they're showing a show on NBC right now, which is The Masked Singer. So, which seemed very, very foreign to me and to my generation. And they told me that this is an American show. Go look at the show in the States, which I watched, and then I tried to compare it with the show and the Arab, you know, that is being circulated and kind of normalized around the Arab world. And indeed, it will become normalized at some point. The younger generation sees it as a duplicate, right, of an existing show. So it really rings a bell to them. They don't see the foreignizing element in it like we do, our generation do. What else? Again, hybridity. I look at it from an identity perspective. I love how you encapsulate it and present it. Now, I know that there are many, and I encourage the audience to post questions. Let me just start by posing a question or two. So how does your Nexus relational epistemology impacted the power dynamics of the narrative that is, that is trying to reimagine a new Middle East? Does it change anything in the power dynamics?
So I believe it does, for a couple of reasons. One, I think if we think of, let's say you're writing a book, right? Or you're conducting a study, and you frame it as the parameters are sort of relatively rigid. The boundaries, here's the Middle East. You would tend to unintentionally obscure some of the power dynamics that shape things that you're studying that would be external to the region. While if you foreground the Middle East as nexus, whether in global economics, international relations, if you explicitly foreground the connections, then I think you have more space to really take into account how different power relations impinge on the context that you're studying. So I have found it easier, at least more natural, perhaps more productive, to foreground the power by foregrounding its sources and its vectors, which can be internal. So I don't want to be misunderstood. Power is not only exercised from outside the Middle East into the Middle East. We all know better than that. But foregrounding it allows us to understand it better.
So turning it from an object to a subject, but also you mentioned relating theories of modern and current Arab thinkers. You think this is an important way of doing it as well?
I think it's an incredibly important aspect of what I hope we can all contribute to. But it's clearly underway. A couple of weeks ago, I spent a few hours at the Doha International Book Fair. I filled my car with books, most of which, are trying to identify the philosophical, religious sources, the contemporary parameters of what an Arab modernity would look like, right? And we have authors from the Gulf, from the Levant, from North Africa, who are all using their own experiences trying to figure that out. And I think we do have, again, not just the opportunity, but the responsibility to all participate in what a negotiated modernity could look like, right? Otherwise, we leave the space open to people who perhaps are much more simplistic or are much more sort of dichotomous in the way they see tradition and modernity.
Definitely, and I think there is a need to update and upgrade our educational systems and curricula, because those need to be embedded as early as possible too, instead of looking at the world from the filters of Eurocentric theories that, and philosophy. I think, yes, definitely, I agree with you. Not wait basically until, a youth reaches his, Northwestern or Hamad bin Khalifa to study and to be introduced to those theories.
Yes, absolutely. And again, schooling systems were shaped by the people who formed them, right?
Exactly.
And so they need to be constantly revisited and changed. Absolutely.
One more question from my side, and I promise I'll stop. How do we capture the locality, yet fluidity of realities in comparison, and what you envision as a transnational and comparative Middle Eastern studies? Do those localities get lost in the equation?
There's clearly a danger. There's clearly a danger of locality, the sort of materiality of local experience getting completely overwhelmed by either global forces, right? National forces, but also by the way we approach it. So I think I want to be sure, that's why I emphasize the need to learn languages, the need to learn about local histories, traditions, cultures, right? The all sort of Orientalist expertise is very important, right? It's something you cannot say after Edward Said's book, right? But the Orientalists did learn the languages, did learn everything they could about the histories, the geographies, the cultures, the societies of the places they were studying. But of course, they did it in a certain way with certain biases. But I think the actual expertise needs to be maintained. That's one way in safeguarding local specificity. But it's also in terms of when you're writing your research, when you're producing your documentary, foregrounding a notion of locality. What is the unique local tempo, to speak of time? What is there a shade of light? You know, so one of the things that I love here is I feel there's a very specific shade of light here in the morning and in the evening in particular that I haven't experienced anywhere else. To me, that's part of locality. That's part of the materiality of locality. So we definitely need to make efforts to safeguard this while studying locality in its broader context.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I'll start taking questions from the audience, and I see several of them here. So Professor Carol Fodda asks, through centering the transnational and the relational in Middle Eastern studies and emphasizing it as a nexus rather than a locus, how do you envision this important shift, reconceptualizing or reimagining academic structures and institutionalized knowledges and training? In other words, what structural as well as pedagogical shifts do we need to emphasize and pursue within academic institutional spaces that would forge these conceptualizations and directions?
So this is clearly a very important question, right? How do you institutionalize ways of knowing in a way that foments and enables future innovation in the way you know, as opposed to creating a rigid structure that stifles new knowledge? And that's the eternal problem, right? So it used to be, for example, that you change department names. You know, universities have done it all the time. I mean, in my field, between rhetoric, ancient rhetoric, contemporary rhetoric, speech, communication, journalism, media, many departments were thrown together, people were fired, new structures were created. I'm not sure that's the best way, to be honest, right? I think the structure that I like is a sort of an appropriation of the notion of the invisible college. The invisible college is the stuff you can create in research networks, in working groups, working at research institutes, of people who come from different experiences, different disciplines, have different linguistic skills, who can come together to discuss common themes. In my experience, that is really the best way. It's kind of a mid-level institutionalization, right? You don't create the department for the study of the Global South, but you create a research institute that invites faculty and students from all kinds of disciplines to discuss and debate what the Global South means, right? So you don't create rigid institutional structure, because guess what? In a year or two, maybe the concept itself is not going to be cutting edge, is not going to be enabling. And that creates a flexibility that can evolve over time, as opposed to developing structure that get rigid and then stop evolving.
I agree with you. Okay, we have another question from Lena. Can you please shed more light on how power dynamics within the South-South relations weigh in on the nexus-based approach?
You know, another excellent question. So there is no space in this world that is not shaped by power. So let's agree on that, right? It used to be that for a while in the 90s, everybody was talking the global and the local. The global was power and the local was, you know, resistance, accommodation, victim, whatever you want to name it. If we think of the Global South as a geopolitical economic space, you know, you have the whales and you have the minnows. You have the giants and you have the tiny ones. You have your Brazils and your China and your South Africa, right? And then you have the very small countries, some of which are completely powerless. So that's one. So within the Global South, there are clearly nodes of power and resistance to power. So we need to clearly understand those, right? But also, I think we need to understand how shifting notions, for example, of identity, right, create a very different valence. I'll give you one example. One of the people who I met at that conference on the Latin East is a brilliant scholar, and she had at least one study about the changing definition, the changing perceptions of Syrians in Brazil, right? So Syrians, which refer to Levantines who went to Brazil before World War I into World War I, are a very valued community. They're identified, their food is celebrated. You know, you can have kibbe and sfiha and all over the place in Brazil on the street, as I discovered a couple of years ago, right? But you now have the new figure of the Syrian migrant who's coming from conflict, right? With the war-torn Syria, the heartbreaking crisis in Syria, who is now interpreted partly through the Bolsonaro rhetoric, the current president of Brazil, the sort of hateful populism, through the lens of terrorism. So suddenly Brazilian society is finding itself schizophrenic in the way its notion of what Syrian identity means, right? Now, this is clearly not about the power of materiality. This is about the power of discourse. So I think we need to keep track of both these two registers of power within the global South and not pretend that it's a space where everybody's equal and everybody's kind and power and violence are not exercised.
We do have a couple of minutes for more questions, so I would accept one or two other questions if you would please post them as soon as possible. Dr. Marwan, from a very selfish angle, what is missing in Middle Eastern Studies department? You would find commonalities within departments or in departments across the region. I'm proud to say that ours is very innovative. When we started with two very innovative programs, but focusing on areas. One is a very pressing area, women's studies, definitely, but the other one is a very new and an innovative area, digital humanities. So it's the only program in the MENA region. What do you think is missing? What can communication offer Middle Eastern studies that could be formed and shaped in a degree?
So, you know, one of the way I describe, you know, again, when I talk about communication, maybe some of my colleagues in communication don't really fully agree with me, right? It's partly my own experience of the field. There's a kind of intellectual restlessness, right? That some of us who were trained in communication experience. Just because we are, you know, if you focus on the gadgets, on the technologies, whatever you know will be passé within 2 or 3 years, right? And I'm speaking as somebody who, you know, sees, for example, very excitedly after all the rush to study the digital, you know, the digital is a tool, right? Now, it's a tool, it's a set of tools that has changed the way we perceive things, but I'm not I'm fully convinced that it has actually changed the world, right? And that everything that came before it is no longer important. So, for example, recently, in the last few years, there have been several excellent books about cassette tapes in the Arab world, about cassette tape as, you know, music, popular music, sort of elite music, religious sermons, all that stuff, right? I think this is beautiful. This is the sort of multiple temporalities, right? Cassette tapes have not disappeared. Cassette tapes still shape a lot of the ways in which we consume music, so on and so forth, right? Not everybody in the world is walking around with an iPod or an iPhone in their pocket. So that's one thing. So this restlessness that I'm talking about, I think, is to never be fully satisfied, not only with your own work, but with the parameters that frame your work. And that's why I think Middle East studies, if we take it for granted that this is the map of the Middle East and what it includes, you know, tames our restlessness. And I think intellectual restlessness is very important to continue building knowledge. It's very important to innovate, right? And if you look at how Middle Eastern studies, as Dr. Hakimian mentioned, you know, in China or in Japan, it's a very different tradition. We tend to be shaped primarily in English-speaking academia, you know, by the US and the UK traditions, but you have also the French tradition, the German tradition, and again, several emerging tradition, in addition to the established ones in Asia, i.e. Japan and China, there are many different ways in which we look at the Middle East, right? The Middle East itself is a geopolitical construction, right? Why is it middle for some and near for others? So I think I will bring it back to, we need to be more intellectually restless and build bridges with people who work in other disciplines and other areas.
The feed just updated, and I have more questions. If you don't mind, 2 or 3 more minutes.
Sure.
Maybe short answers, but I don't want to disappoint audience. Let's start from the ending. What about power relations in the Global South? How do we deal with those? I think you've touched on it already. Do you want to add something about it?
Yeah, briefly, by taking into account both the sort of the political economic aspect, the geopolitical aspect, and the discursive aspect of how power operates. The example of the construction of Syrians in Brazil as the discursive level, but also the fact that, you know, a country like China or Brazil has at their disposal material tools that most countries in the Global South do not have.
Thank you, Professor Kraidy, for the inspiring talk. At the beginning of your lecture, you referred to the importance of ethics and the quest for decolonizing and reconceptualizing Middle Eastern studies. Could you elaborate more on the ethical dimension of this struggle? This is by Sophie, Professor Sophie. Yes.
Thank you. Look, decolonization is a very fraught world. If you noticed, a lot of the things I described and analyzed could be understood as, or are being discussed as, decolonization, but I avoid the word on purpose, because before you decolonize something, it has to have been colonized first, right? Middle East studies, as we've inherited it, is a Western creation, right? So it wasn't a colonization of anything people in the region were already doing, as much as it was a Western creation. Yes, colonial, yes, imperial, but so I'm a little. I think I would like us to really define our concepts before we use decolonize about everything. But I think the heart of your question is very important, right? Which is, yes, to get rid of some ways of knowing that are imposed from the outside. You do have to engage with them. I think my issue with a lot of decolonization literature is oftentimes it's not very familiar with what it's trying to decolonize, which is why some works stand out, right? In other words, know what is it that we need. We need to know for sure what is it that we need to decolonize, understand it, learn it before we can change it. Trying to change something before we know it almost never ends well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question from Mark Jones. There has been some discussion about erosions of freedom of speech in the global academy in terms of knowledge production, especially in a South-to-South context. Do you foresee such issues as significant barrier to pursuing a renewed knowledge creation agenda on specific topics? If so, can we as scholars address this?
So absolutely. Hi, Mark. Yes, it's definitely. I mean, the sort of the look. Every place in the world has its topics that you cannot discuss or that you could discuss, but with dire consequences, right? So I think in some ways, one of the things I like to do when you're trying to change, to affect a system to change positively, right? I go back to the previous thing. Learn the language of the oppressive system, then negotiate with it, and inserting your own language in between, right? The problem today, I think, that we have is, we have a lot of scholars that, look at our region. Most scholars can write very little in their own countries, right? There are a few places where a lot of people are running away from. They're running away from economic collapse. They're running away from political repression. They're running away from this or that. And so that's definitely a huge obstacle to academic freedom. But think about it, great schools like the Frankfurt School were born out of circumstances like this, right? There's always resistance to power, and part of the resistance to power is creativity, is innovation, is trying to think the world in new terms.
Okay, last question is how can we benefit from the concept of transdisciplinarity and the research experience from the Global South perspective?
Look, it's clearly, I think there's a difference between interdisciplinarity or now transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, right? I think the unfortunate truth, if you look at most PhD granting institutions in the world, that granting is disciplinary, right? We talk a lot about interdisciplinarity. In some cases, for example, in Middle East studies, you could study focus on history and political science, right? Or history and sociology. But the vast majority of graduate training is still in spaces that are shaped by one discipline, right? Much more so than in the sciences, by the way. We tend to think that, oh, we're much more fluid and much more multidisciplinary than the sciences. That is not true anymore, right? How do we take advantages? Again, these institutionalization at sort of a meso level, not at a macro level, and not only at a micro level, through working groups, institutes, networks. But it's very hard work. You know, you're going to have to read 3 or 4 times as much as you read if you really want to master fields that come from different disciplines. It's very, very hard.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm afraid we have to end. Gerd Noneman sends his regards and thank us all for this panel. Thanks our keynote for an amazing and rich talk. I'll hand it over to Dr. Hakimian, but Dr. Marwan, lovely to have you. I'm telling you, you are going to leave us with food for thought that we'll need to digest all through the day. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
To you.
Thank you so much. We couldn't have asked for a better start, to be honest. This has been extremely rich, thought-provoking, stimulating, and a lot more than we could have asked for initiating a conference that obviously continues in the afternoon and tomorrow. So thank you for that. Just if I can maybe also ask for clarification, Marwan, from my position. I know we've officially ended the session time, but I listen to interest because in economics, we also talk about South-South relations and North-North and North-South. But I was somehow fascinated because you seem at times to just juxtapose the South vis-a-vis the West. And that's where my bearings got lost.
Yes.
Yeah. And I was wondering whether this was deliberate. And if I may be even more provocative, how would we deal with Japan then? If Japan is not the West, is it not in the South? Where would that be?
So,
you know, my generation was brought up in the leftist, rightist frame of thought. Then, of course, it was East and West or West, the rest. Then we now have North, South. So, you know, there's obviously a lot of push and pull to go in different directions. And the clarity of what actually we put into the South box is very important. So maybe
you know, absolutely. But, you know, so a quick answer, this was definitely deliberate because, you know, I don't believe you can study the Global South without accounting for the forces that have shaped it historically and that continue to shape it, which a lot of which come from the Global North. So that's one. Two, of course, there are countries that fit in that category in a sort of taken for granted way. But Japan is clearly an exception, you know. I definitely would not put Japan in the Global South. There's a big debate about whether China is still to be included in the Global South or not, right? It depends on the parameter. If you take level of development, or what we used to call level of development, if you take GDP per capita, what is the metric? I do think all of these are up for debate. And I do agree with you, it's very confusing, which is why I will not say, you know, here's what I think as the Global South, right? I do think though in general, we're talking about countries with a certain level of economic development. I mean, it's not only Japan. I think some countries in the Gulf now there's a question mark. do they belong to the Global South or not? I don't know, but I think it would be great to maybe in the future, have panels that narrow down on like, what are the metrics? Can we agree on what these would be? I don't know.
Excellent. I take some comfort from your remark that we need some data to inform our discussions of the regions. As an economist, I couldn't agree more. So thank you for that. Well, as I said, this has really been whetting our appetite. So huge thanks on behalf of our participants, of which we have had excellent numbers. I must say we've had outstanding number of registrations, and we have had the pleasure of participation by a large number of people, as I said, despite the challenges of different time zones. And of course, we expect these numbers to go up very well. Let me very briefly, in the 2 minutes that remain, we have, of course, exceeded the time already, remind us that there are 2 sessions this afternoon. The first one is, in fact, focused on power dynamics at regional and international levels. In particular, we look at how changing circumstances affect the relationship between the region and the wider world from a political perspective. The next one after that this afternoon actually focuses on knowledge processing and how big data methods and growing information processing capabilities and AI affect the state of humanities. Someone asked about digital humanities, what it means. Look, we have lined up 4 speakers in the second afternoon session, so I very much hope you get plenty of insight on the knowledge aspect of our theme. Tomorrow, we start with a session on gender dynamics, which has already been mentioned, in relation to cities and space, a very interesting angle and perspective on this theme, important theme. And last but not least, I'm very proud to say that our concluding session is on knowledge and power in Palestine. It's probably hard to find a better example of where power asymmetry and marginalization in the context of both geographical and cultural historical area study manifests itself. It's imperative that we make Palestine studies, we keep it alive, and we are very happy to contribute to that effort. So Palestine studies is definitely an important part of the South studies and the transnational studies that Professor Kraidy talked about. So with that, thank you so much for your contributions, for your interest, for your patience. And of course, a recording of this session and our forthcoming sessions will be made available on YouTube. I hope you will join us. There's plenty of material to think about. And I can easily see if this particular session had been kept at its original format, which was to be in person, and as we went off for some nice lunch, we would be battling over a host of deep, rich, really engaging concepts, ideas, and challenges that we have been thrust upon. All the best, have a good break, and see you later at 4 p.m. Doha time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.